Hey guys, what's up? It's Natasha and welcome back to this week's video. Today I will be discussing all the books that I read in both December and January. It is mainly because I never gave a December wrap up because everything was just too much. So I decided to just mesh the two together. If you're excited for this video, please remember to like, subscribe, comment down below how many books you read in January and what was your favorite in January. And without any further ado, let's just jump right into the video. So the first book I read in December was Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill, and this was an arc that I received via NetGalley. It's essentially a Frankenstein retelling. We follow Frankenstein's long-distance niece, and she discovers his journals about how he created Frankenstein's monster. And she and her husband, who are very low on the scientist chain, they want to become famous in this area. She especially because she's a woman in science, and women in science don't get this whole, I don't know, they're not praised for their work because women can't be scientists, that kind of thing. So she is working super hard to create this monster, and it's essentially a recreation of a dinosaur. But the more time she spends with it, the more she starts falling in love with the monster, and then she starts thinking, is this really something I want to introduce into the world? It might not be a monster, but the people might not think the same. And this was as a result of her husband's sister, who reacted quite strangely towards the monster that she saw. She actually freaked out about it. So I did enjoy this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The only thing is, it was a very dragged out book. So from the point where we were introduced to the characters up until the point where she found the journal and then they started working on this monster, I think it was over 200 pages, and that was just a bit much for me. I also understand that it had to be slow paced because you had to be introduced to the characters, to the nemesis, to everything. And overall, I really did enjoy this book. It was fun to read, like a historical fiction. It's definitely not a romance, but it was just fun climbing into that kind of perspective for a few days and reliving in the 1800s how women were treated, how men thought they were the greatest. Seeing how the character, I think her name was Mary as well, how she tries to just get herself known by everyone. She is not this timid woman that just sits down. She actually speaks her mind, and that is something that annoys her husband as well. But, you know, you get the good with the bad. So the next book I read, which was also my second favorite in my December 2022 wrap up, was The Dive by Sara Ochs, or Ochs. I think it's Ochs. Okay, this book follows a group of 4 or 5 people on an island in Thailand, and one of the specific people we focus on is a diving instructor. Now, she has a very dark past, and she doesn't want her fiance to know about her dark past, but essentially what we learn throughout is she's involved in the murder of her sister. We don't know how, we just know that she feels guilty about everything. She's also involved in the murder of her father. There's reasons and explanations behind that. And then we follow another girl who is set out to make friends with this diving instructor, but she has like a hidden agenda as to why she wants to become friends with this person. And while they are, you know, just living life on this island, there are 3 murders happening, and each of these murders are connected to the 5 people mentioned. And it's not this group coming together and solving the mystery, but more over the 2 main characters who come together and finally realize that they are dealing with something much darker and much more sinister. And I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book. It was so nail-biting, it was gripping. I wanted more, and I still want to know more because the book also ended on a huge cliffhanger. The author tied everything in a neat little bow, and then at the end of everything she just pulled the one string and that whole thing just exploded, and it paves the way for a sequel. But yeah, it was an interesting book. Then the next book I read was an Afrikaans book called Circus by Irma Venter, and I gave this book also a 5 out of 5 stars. Really enjoyed it. And essentially, this is about a woman who is running her own restaurant. Well, she was part of this whole cartel of sending money to South Africa during the apartheid era. And, she built a romance with this very dodgy kind of guy. Eventually, she escaped him. She's living in South Africa, but she's also very paranoid because she's also behind his arrest. And then one day, this man rocks up in South Africa and he's like, "Did you miss me?" They were not supposed to let him go out of jail, but he had health issues, and just how she struggles with the past and how the present come together, and how she has to fight with all the secrets that she kept down just so that she can keep the people she loved safe. And that is essentially what made me give it a 5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed this book so much more than I thought I actually would. And I am definitely a big fan of Irma Venter now. She writes exceptionally well, and just these gripping tales of how she captures the reader in the book is what made me sit and listen to this book the whole day. Then the next book I read was Christmas Letters by Jenny Hale, and this essentially follows a woman who is on the top of her career. She has the boyfriend that she always wanted, but she's not happy. The Hallmark type of I'm not happy. And then she has to also fight with her boyfriend because she's trying to give attention to her mother, but her boyfriend is unhappy because it's during a charity event. Now she moves back to her mother's house. She starts reliving the life on the farm. She essentially hated the farm life and moved to the city. Now she's back and she's meeting this mysterious guy who I believe is kind of part of a whole property heist type of thing happening there. But she doesn't know it, but obviously they fall in love and that kind of thing. And I couldn't read this book. It got annoying very fast, and I think I DNF'd it at like 31%. I just couldn't get through it. So I can't give you my honest opinion. It was just too much for me at that point, so I just left it. Then the last book I read for December was A Forbidden Fate by Kevin Herning, and this was my ultimate favorite book for December. I really enjoyed the enemies to lovers perspective. There is this element where the two characters can't touch each other because they have been cursed, so that was also quite interesting. And that is essentially the premise of the book. It's a prince and a princess who were sworn to be enemies but were destined to marry each other up until a day when something horrible happened and the gods cursed them to never touch again. If they so much as brush against one another, they will die and their kingdoms will fall apart. And then one day the princess gets a letter from a prince who was their best friend, and he wants to marry her because his old wife died and he wants to strengthen their unity together as different kinds of kingdoms. And on her way to this king, the prince who she's not allowed to touch and his group of bandits, they hijack her whole carriage and the people around them and keep her hostage and ransom so that they can essentially ask her father for money in return for her alive. But things go really wrong, and these two, enemies to lovers, that kind of thing, it's very prevalent in this book, but it's also such an amazing book. I read it so quickly and I really want to dive right back into that world. It was just set up so beautifully, and I'm really looking forward to the sequel because boy, that book ended on a cliffhanger. Right, and now we move to January. The first book I read in January was A School Without Princes, which is the second book in School for Good and Evil. And basically this just follows up after Agatha and Sophie have left the world for the School for Good and Evil, and they are back at their home. They are happy, but Agatha is not as happy as she seems. Sophie, on the other hand, is fighting this very evil that's still brewing inside of her, and she doesn't want to be evil, but it feels like it just wants to devour her. And then one day when Sophie's father marries the woman that she despises, Agatha just gives the small wish of she wished she chose the prince instead of Sophie, and this opens the portal back up to the world for the School for Good and Evil. But everything has changed because Agatha and Sophie chose each other instead of choosing princes, and the schools are now split between the School for Girls and the School for Boys, and the boys hate the girls and the girls they don't even care about their appearances anymore. And the princes want to kill Sophie so that the prince can finally be with Agatha. That was a very big description. And I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy it. There were just some elements where I felt that the second book kind of repeated the storyline of the first book. You know, they arrived at the place, there was confusion, they tried to fight that they were there, and then they had to go by a trial just to win. But there is a new villain in place, and the more the villain's arc story comes out, the more you want to know what's happening. And that's what actually kept me going and kept me reading. The next book I read was A River of Shadows by Karina Hall. I believe that's how you pronounce her name. She's a Finnish author, and she wrote a book that consists out of death, but in the Finnish law kind of situation. So we get a new perspective of, it's kind of like Beauty and the Beast meets Heidi and Persephone, but with a lot of smut, that kind of thing. And it's not bad. It's a very good book. It's just the downside is that the whole blurb was 50% of the book. So I felt it was kind of slow. I felt like there were more things needed, but essentially I did enjoy the book, and this was my favorite book for January. Actually, come to think of it, it might be my lowest rated book, but it is the best book that I enjoyed. So this book follows Hannah Heikkinen, and she is going to Lapland because her father unfortunately died unexpectedly. And while she is at his resort where he stays, there are 2 people who are trying to attack her. And she is rescued by someone who's called Rasmus, and he says they must go to the underworld to save her father. And here she follows him in a journey to the underworld and sells her soul to death to save her father. Now, that all 50% of the book. So, like I say, it could have just happened in the first 3 chapters, but you know, the world building is exceptional and it is amazing, and I really did enjoy that aspect of the book. The smut as well is very good, even though it only ends up in like 75% mark of it. It's very good. The next book I read was another Afrikaans book called Middernacht by Sydney Gilroy, and this book follows a detective who is tasked in finding the serial killer who is targeting young girls between the ages of 4 and 5. Or what really gets him going into this case is when he discovers a body in these white big ice cream buckets. He finds a young girl in there and he decides that he's going to investigate it, and he knows exactly who it is. Not the suspect itself, but there's a murderer that they call the Smiley murderer, and then they redubbed it to the Universitas murderer, and how he stays on this murderer's trial the whole time in the book. And this book was good. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because it was just too gory for me. I listened to it because I don't have the physical book with me, and there were times where I pulled out my earphones and I just put everything down because the descriptions were just too much. This book needs to come with a lot of warning. So that is the only downside, is the description, but it's also an upside because it gives very in detail things of the situations that happen around the murders and everything. There was just also this one point where the murderer explained in detail what they were doing to this child, and I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. And that's what knocked the stars off to a 3. And then the final books or comics that I read for this month was the Heartstopper series, 1, 2, 4. And this is essentially about 2 guys who meet and they fall in love. And the one who's an openly gay person, but the other one who is struggling to get to know his body and to get to know himself. And eventually he discovers that he's bisexual. He falls in love with Charlie. And it's just such a sweet series to read. It's available on Webtoons. It's very quick to read and it's just very entertaining. There's also heavy topics discussed. I think for a lot of things in our day and age, when you come out as gay, people are still, especially in South Africa, I don't know if it's like this in other countries, there's this, oh no, you can't be gay, that's like a sickness or something. So it's a lot of heavy topics. They discuss anorexia, they discuss eating disorders, they discuss depression as well in there. So there's a lot of trigger warnings, but it's a very sweet series nonetheless. That is it for my December and January wrap up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you read any of these books, please let me know down below, and I'll see you guys in a video next week. Bye.